In March 1943, a single American cruiser was left dead in the water, facing an entire Japanese fleet alone. Tasked with cutting Japan's supply line to 2 occupied islands in Alaska, Salt Lake City's hull is now torn open below the waterline. Her engines are dead. She's drifting. 10 miles out, the Japanese are closing. On the bridge, Captain Bertram Rogers and his executive officer exchange a look, quote, "Well, I guess this is it." The Americans brace for the final blow. The Japanese move in to deliver it. Deep inside the ship, the men in the engine room don't know that everything now depends on them. The morning of March 26, 1943, broke over the Bering Sea with an almost unnatural, eerie calm. In these waters, located in the northwestern part of the Pacific, wedged between Alaska and Russia, the freezing water was flat and the sky clear, not a cloud in sight. Standing on the bridge of his flagship, the light cruiser Richmond, was Rear Admiral Charles McMorris. With a nearly photographic memory, and often being the sharpest strategic thinker in the room, he was aptly nicknamed Socrates. Now, following a stellar debut at Pearl Harbor that made Admiral Nimitz keep him on as his personal war planner, he commanded a small force consisting of Richmond, 4 destroyers, Bailey, Coughlin, Dale, and Monaghan, all protected by the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, nicknamed Swayback Maru by her own crew, because wartime weight had her riding so low her waist was perpetually awash. Salt Lake City had only joined this team 11 days earlier, fresh from 4 months of repairs at Pearl Harbor after taking damage near Guadalcanal. Her captain, Bertram Rogers, had taken command just 2 months before. Half her crew was straight from boot camp. Though she'd never worked with these ships before, she was set to be their shield during their mission. According to Allied intelligence, a Japanese supply convoy was heading through with light escort, 1 cruiser at most, a handful of destroyers, bound for Attu and Kiska, 2 small islands at the western tip of the Aleutian chain that Japan had been occupying for almost a year, ever since Midway. The convoy was carrying materials to finish building a Japanese airstrip there, and supplies to keep a garrison on soil that belonged to the United States. McMorris's job was to make sure none of it arrived. With his force size to match their enemy, as they approached their destination, the cooks made sandwiches. The gunners polished their pieces. The Rear Admiral even called it a Roman holiday, an easy, entertaining spectacle at someone else's expense. Then, just past 7:30 a.m., radar picked up 5 contacts to the north. The operators called it in. Transports, lightly screened, exactly what intelligence had promised. Just as McMorris puffed his chest in pride, the count changed abruptly. 5 contacts became 7, then 9, then 10. In the growing light, lookouts climbed higher and strained their eyes north. It was nearly a dozen Imperial ships, all closing at high speed. With this, Rear Admiral McMorris's Roman holiday was over. What the American force was looking at was Imperial Vice Admiral Hosagaya's entire Northern Fifth Fleet, 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Maya, 2 light cruisers, Tama and Abukuma, followed by 4 destroyers. And tucked behind all of it, 3 supply ships loaded with materials to finish building a Japanese airstrip on American soil. Because heavy cruiser Maya had just finished repairs from damage sustained at Guadalcanal, arriving at the Japanese base at Paramushiro only weeks before the battle, American intelligence completely missed her presence. As Hosagaya turned his warship southeast to engage, placing his fleet between the Americans and every friendly port within 500 miles. On the other side, Rear Admiral Sock quickly considered his options. The leader knew the incoming Japanese force outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. In addition to being newer and heavier than Salt Lake City, Nachi and Maya together carried enough firepower to take apart every ship in McMorris's task group at ranges his own guns could barely reach. He could turn and run, but the Japanese were faster and would pick his ships apart one by one from behind. He could close the distance and fight at short range, but his force would be at the bottom of the Pacific before he got there. Or he could stay at long range, keep moving, and make the Japanese earn every inch. With Hosogaya's fleet sitting between him and every friendly port in the northern Pacific, and the nearest American aircraft hours away, Socrates chose to fight. The Japanese Nachi opened fire first, at a range of 20,000 yards, with this initial salvo falling just short of Richmond. The heavy cruiser had Richmond in her sights once again for her second salvo. It was about to start hitting when one of her own crew members accidentally switched the generator, supplying power to her main battery to the wrong boiler, causing her entire forward turrets to freeze and point uselessly at the morning sky, though this mistake cost her perhaps a minute. The American flagship used this precious time to slip out of the range she'd so carefully found. Then, the Japanese shifted their attention to Salt Lake City. For the next 3.5 hours, the longest continuous gunnery duel in modern naval history, the two fleets fired at each other across 8 to 12 miles of freezing Arctic water in broad daylight, with nowhere to hide and no way out. As Salt Lake City and the Japanese heavy cruisers circled and fired, Captain Bertram Rogers and his executive officer, Commander Worthington Bittler, fell into a sort of rhythm. Each time a salvo fell close enough to drench the ship, Rogers shifted course, and the next burst would explode exactly where she would have been. The skipper was reading the Japanese gunners by instinct, steering through the spaces between their shells. After one particularly close salvo fell harmlessly in Salt Lake City's wake, Rogers grinned and said he had fooled them again. Just then, a shell from Maya found the starboard spotting plane, mounted on her catapult amidships. The resulting explosion sent hot metal tearing through the ship's waist in every direction, immediately taking the life of Lieutenant Commander Windsor Gale, who the night before had won a poker pot with aces and eights and joked that he held the dead man's hand. Though the burning wreckage of the plane was thrown overboard before it could spread to the ship below it, and Salt Lake City kept firing everything she had left in her magazines and kept moving, something was changing below her decks. In the forward magazines deep within the ship, men were already working in nearly impossible conditions. The aft guns were running low on shells, but the forward magazines still had plenty. The problem was that the forward guns couldn't reach the Japanese from where Rogers was holding her, so the only option was to move the ammunition by hand. With sweat all over their uniforms, the men loaded each of the 250-pound shells onto hand dollies and pushed them aft through passageways that were tilting under their boots as the ship listed from the water she was taking on. At 11:03 a.m., another Japanese shell hit Salt Lake City below the waterline on her port side, passing through one fuel tank before exploding in another. Shaking the ship so violently, it threw everyone off their feet. As even more seawater began pushing through the torn hull into her forward compartments, the heavy cruiser slowed and listed even more. Down in the engineering spaces, men worked in rising water that was so cold it was almost impossible to think, trying to keep the pumps clear, the boilers fed, and the ship moving as best they could, everyone well aware that if she stopped, she would never start again. When someone turned the wrong valve, instead of flooding a ballast tank to correct her list, seawater poured directly into the boilers, taking out the very fires that kept her engines running. Then Salt Lake City ground to a halt. Captain Rogers could feel his ship faltering right under his feet. Using those last few seconds of sheer momentum, the skipper swung her around so that every gun she had could point at what everyone knew was coming. It was the last thing he could do for his crew. Then Commander Worthington Bittler walked across the bridge, looked at his captain, and quietly shook his hand and said, quote, "Well, I guess this is it." Back on board flagship Richmond, McMorris was watching his force's now damaged protector drift and ordered his ship to move closer to her, intending to take off her crew, already preparing for the worst. Still, he had one more decision to make. 3 of his destroyers, Bailey, Coughlin, and Monaghan, were smaller and lighter than his cruisers, and some of them might make it out before the Japanese could run them down. The 4th, Dale, was the only thing keeping Salt Lake City hidden behind her smokescreen. The other option was to send the trio directly at the Japanese cruisers in a reckless daylight torpedo attack. Japanese guns outranged American torpedoes by miles, which meant the 3 destroyers would be steaming into concentrated fire from multiple cruisers for a long time before they even had a chance to shoot back. With no other way to protect his force, Sock McMorris ordered the attack. Bailey led, valiantly bursting out of the smokescreen at full speed, Coughlin and Monahan following right behind her. Her own stack smoke and chemical generators gave the ships behind her some thin cover. Still, nothing concealed Bailey herself, and every Japanese gun in range swung around and opened fire at once, the shell splashes so thick and fast around her hull that men watching from Salt Lake City's deck said it looked like Niagara Falls erupting from the water around a single ship. On board the beleaguered heavy cruiser, the crewmen who'd just begun to make peace with their end now watched 3 small ships sail deliberately into that wall of fire to buy them the minutes they needed. Overcome with emotion, the men wept uncontrollably. Despite taking a shell on her starboard side that tore through her engine room, Bailey kept going. Even when she took another hit that skidded across her deck and came to a stop without exploding, her crew rolled a live 8-inch shell over the side. At 9,500 yards, she fired all 5 torpedoes, although every single one of them ran past the enemy and out into the open ocean. As the Japanese fleet spent these minutes maneuvering to avoid the torpedoes, behind the smokescreen, something else was happening aboard Salt Lake City. Something that nobody on the Japanese side could see. Down in our engineering spaces, men had been standing chest-deep in water for the better part of an hour, working by feel in the dark, hands gone numb, trying to purge seawater from the fuel lines. In the midst of this, because Bailey's torpedo run had forced the Japanese fleet to maneuver and change course, Salt Lake City's crew had bought themselves just enough time. And when the boilers finally caught and the engines turned, the heavy cruiser shuddered back to life. She was moving, but Bailey was already limping, and the Japanese were still out there, still closing, still firing into the smoke. With the magazines at an all-time low, there was nothing left to throw at them. And then, one by one, the shapes on the horizon began to shrink. Nachi and Maya, the heavy cruisers that had been hunting Salt Lake City for 3.5 hours, were turning west. The light cruisers behind them were turning too. The destroyers, the whole fleet, every ship was withdrawing. Because Salt Lake City had long since fired through her entire stock of armor-piercing shells, she switched to high explosive rounds from her nearly empty magazines, which left different colored bursts when they hit the water. To the Japanese crews, watching the splashes fall across their ships, those bursts looked exactly like bombs dropped from aircraft above the overcast. The American air cover had finally arrived. As a result, the Japanese ships began firing their anti-aircraft guns into the empty sky. Hosagaya, his fuel already low, and his ammunition below the minimum his doctrine required, concluded that American air power had arrived and ordered his fleet to withdraw. He was entirely wrong. Back on Salt Lake City, the log entry summarized the entire day's events well. Quote, "This day, the hand of divine providence lay over the ship. Never before in her colorful history has death been so close for so long a time. Following his embarrassing fault, Hosagaya was relieved of command within weeks and forced into retirement in disgrace. In contrast, Rear Admiral McMorris was promoted to Nimitz's personal chief of staff within months. From there, Japan never attempted another surface resupply run to the Aleutians, and the Empire switched entirely to submarines, which could not carry anything remotely close to what the garrisons needed. By the time the American forces took back Attu, the Japanese garrison, cut off and starving, fought to the absolute last man. From 2,500 soldiers, a mere 28 survived.